Hi there, welcome to Boy Meets Quilt. I'm Andrew Vay Hansen. It has been a while since I posted anything on my channel. I was very busy this past fall with work, and so I just didn't have time to make any new videos once I was finished with my virtual trunk show. I hope you've been watching those videos. I hope you enjoyed them. And please always feel free to send me any messages or make comments for any questions you might have or whatever. This is all about the community, and I want to make sure everyone is communicating with each other and building this amazing making and quilting community that has been developing over the years, especially with social media and YouTube. So today, I'm not going to show off any of my quilts or anything like that. Instead, I wanted to do my top 10 tools that I use on a regular basis that I actually find very helpful. Now, obviously, if you've done any sort of catalog looking or internet looking of quilting tools and notions, you will find thousands of items that are really fun and people have their favorites. And I've picked up things here and there based on recommendations I've seen online that maybe haven't changed my quilting game in any way. But there are a few things that I use all the time that definitely help me along my journey of quilt making. And I would like to share some of those with you. So, my first tool that I use on a somewhat regular basis, I use a bunch of these rubber-tipped clamps, you can see. These I use for table basting. So I live in a small one-bedroom apartment here in Brooklyn, New York, as I've mentioned in past videos. And I just don't have the floor space. Like, even if I were to get rid of all the furniture in my apartment, I don't have a room large enough to lay out an entire, say, queen-sized or king-sized quilt and pin baste it on my floor. And so I have to use the table basting method. I can put a link in the comments below. I've done some large quilts in the past that have required me to use this specific method. And so I highly recommend these clamps. And what's nice about these clamps in particular is the rubber coating. And so they don't harm any of your fabric. I just got these at my local hardware store, and these are just the right size for the table you might see behind me to clamp right onto that table. Tool number 2. I use EQ8, and that is a software program that I use on my computer in order to help with the design of my quilts. Now, I don't use it for all of my quilts, but I find it helpful particularly when I'm working with traditional blocks. And for one thing, EQ8 comes with an extensive library of traditional quilt blocks that I have used quite often. What I most often use the program for is once I have an idea of the blocks and the setup of the quilt that I want to make, I program that into EQ8, and then I can adjust the size of the sashing, the borders, I can make some color changes, and it just gives me a nice visual of what it's going to look like as a finished product. And then the program easily calculates the amount of yardage you need for the fabric when you're dealing with things like sashing and borders, which I find very helpful. Tool number 3 that I use, again, not all the time, but when I do use it, it's very helpful. These Wonder Clips, I'm sure I see them all the time on YouTube. People use these Wonder Clips all the time for many different things. And I use Wonder Clips generally when I'm facing a quilt. When I'm hand binding a quilt, for whatever reason, I'm just fine folding over the binding and hand sewing it as I go along. I don't have any problems with that. But when I'm facing a quilt, there's that really thick 1/4 inch seam of the quilt sandwich that you have to fold over to get the facing all the way to the other side of the back of the quilt. And that's just too much for my hands. It's too much stress on my hands. And so I end up using the Wonder Clips. I fold it the entire quilt over and then clip it with these Wonder clips, and I like that rather than using pins, because then I'm not poking my fingers with pins every time I'm moving the quilt. I hand baste in my lap. I'm not poking pins into my lap while I'm moving the quilt around. These Wonder Clips don't poke at all. They're just little pieces of plastic, little plastic clamps. And I'd like to stop for a moment and just ask if anyone else watching this video has ever used any of these Wonder Clips and what you would use them for. And if you have other recommendations of other ways to hold things together while you're working other than pins or Wonder Clips. You know, it's always helpful to get some useful tools out there for people to share. Tool number 4 is this amazing scalpel that I bought. I bought this from Victoria Findlay Wolf's shop. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Victoria Findlay Wolf. I'm fortunate enough to have her shop here in New York City, where I live, so I can actually visit it in person. At least I could pre-pandemic. And they're incredibly helpful for ripping out seams super fast. So instead of using your traditional seam ripper, which can take some time, if you have 2 pieces of fabric with a seam that you want to rip, you put one end of the fabric clamped down. I usually use the presser foot on my sewing machine. You clamp that down, you kind of hold the other end tightly, and you just very, very lightly just touch the threads of the seam, and they just melt away. It's so fast. And then you have to deal with like getting rid of the threads, and there are different tools to use for that. I haven't bought any of those yet, and I probably will at some point because I have to rip seams more often than I would like. But anyway, this scalpel is so much better than a seam ripper. Now I still use my seam ripper for things like if I have to pick out some quilting and dealing with like surface stitches. I'm a little afraid to use the scalpel because it is so sharp. I don't want it to rip the actual fabric. So I will use the seam ripper for that. But anytime I'm ripping out a seam, I always use the scalpel. You will be amazed at how quickly it goes. It's brilliant. Tool number 5 is my Hera marker. Now, I use this almost exclusively for marking on my quilts. When I'm marking designs on my quilt tops, particularly if they're straight line designs, I prefer using a Hera marker over any other tool. I have used marking tools in the past, like ceramic chalk and erasable ink and things that will wash away. And when I've used those things in the past, they do wash away on first glance, and then under certain lighting, I can still see the mark. And that drives me crazy. So I prefer using this tool in order to, that just creates creases in your fabric that I then use to stitch on those creases. Now I usually use this in combination with a ruler, unless I'm doing some sort of very gentle curve. So I highly recommend this. I much prefer it over chalk on marking my quilts. Okay, tool number 6 that I think we're starting to get into the tools that I use all of the time and that I kind of can't live without. And so this is really getting into my top 5 tools here. So tool number 6, we have my design wall. Now I'm going to show some pictures of my design wall close up. I basically took a piece of queen-sized batting, I folded over one of the long edges twice and seamed it, and then I used some grommets, a grommet maker and grommets to put grommets all along that edge, that seamed edge. And then I nailed some nails into the top of my hallway wall. The hallway is the only wall in my apartment that is long enough for something that's queen-sized to be displayed on the design wall. And when I'm piecing together quilt tops for like charity quilts where it's just patching, which I'm just doing patchwork, I need something that large to put all the patches together to make sure I have them in the order that I want to sew them in. Batting is perfect to put pieces of fabric. I don't ever have to pin things into the design wall unless I'm already pieced things together into almost a full-sized quilt, in which case then the fabric becomes too heavy to just stick on the wall by itself, and then I'll just safety pin it at the top of the wall. But otherwise, when we're just dealing with like, you know, squares of fabric, large, somewhat large pieces of fabric that have been pieced together, I can just stick them on the wall and leave them. And they don't fall off, they don't have to be pinned. It's amazing. And then I can easily move them around. And I don't know how I would design quilts without a design wall. I think it's a tool that kind of, once you start making your own quilts from your own designs, it's a tool that you're going to have to invest in at some point. That's my opinion. I'd be interested to know if anyone else has some different options for a design wall. So let me know. Put something in the comments. I'm interested to know what you people out there are doing to solve these issues. Tool number 7 is my wool pressing mat. And I have a picture of that right here. I gotta say, I love my wool pressing mat. You know, there are certain things that you think, oh, people say this is a game changer, and then you buy it and you're like, it's a little better. I think the wool pressing mat is kind of a game changer when it comes to pressing your fabrics. I tend to be a heavy presser, which is not good for quilters. And so I've been trying not to be such a heavy presser because it can distort your blocks when you manipulate the fabric too much when you're pressing your seams. And so you're supposed to just press rather than like move your iron around. And before my pressing mat, I never felt like I could get those seams really nice and flat without really like distorting the fabric. And then with the pressing mat, because it absorbs the heat and the steam from your iron and then brings it up to the bottom of what you're pressing, and then the iron's on top, your fabric is getting basically pressed from two sides, and I don't have to work so hard. And suddenly, like, you just press that iron down on your fabric and it all just lays so nice and flat. I love my wool pressing mat. The next tool is related to the pressing mat, and it's my Rowenta iron. I know everyone has different feelings about irons and quilting and to steam or not to steam and all of that kind of stuff. I am a big old fan of steam pressing, and so because of that, I highly recommend the Rowenta irons that have the steam holes that basically cover almost the entire plate of the iron. So much steam. They produce so much steam. Now that means I have to fill it with water a lot more than I would with an iron that doesn't have as many steam holes in the plate, but I think it's worthwhile. I love my Rowenta. All right, tool number 9 is my Sew Steady insert. It is an acrylic, basically an acrylic table that you put your sewing machine in, and it creates a nice flat surface for you to sew on. Now, if I were just doing regular sewing on a regular basis, I would not need this insert quite as much. I wouldn't consider it my number 9 tool, like my almost top number 1 tool. But because I'm a quilter, especially free motion quilting, I need a nice flat space level with the area where I'm sewing on my machine. Otherwise, you're having gravity pull and stretch your quilt around, and you can only work on tiny little areas. I can't even imagine how I could do the free motion quilting I do on such large pieces that I work on without something, either this insert or an actual sewing table where you place your machine into the table and it lies flat along the top of the table. Now, I would love one of those, but I just don't have a sewing table at this point. So in the meantime, I have a regular table and a sewing machine and this Sew Steady insert, and it has worked wonderfully. Okay, and now we come to my number 1 favorite quilting tool. This is tool number 10 in my list, I guess, but it is my top tool that I just love so much, and that is my 1/4 inch presser foot. that I bought specifically for this Janome machine. Now, obviously, my machine came with several presser feet, and they're all fine. But I needed, when I started to realize how much I wanted to quilt, I decided I needed an actual 1/4 inch presser foot. And these are made specifically for quilters because almost all of your seams are going to be 1/4 inch seams. And so what's great about this presser foot, and any presser foot that's made for quilting with the 1/4 inch foot, is that you put this foot on your machine, and then the needle to the edge of the toe of your presser foot is exactly a 1/4 inch. And so you can just line the edge of your seam up with the edge of this presser foot toe, and you will always have a perfect 1/4 inch seam. And then what's even more brilliant about this particular presser foot is that the needle hole is wide enough that if I need to move the needle a little bit one way or the other, if I'm dealing with a pattern that requires a scant 1/4 inch, it has enough space where where I can still use the presser foot and have the needle moved over just a smidge to either direction. Which, when I work with other people's patterns, is something I often have to do because they assume that you're doing a scant 1/4 inch of seam rather than a perfect 1/4 inch seam. Also, this particular presser foot has markings, which I've seen this on a lot of presser feet, and it's really handy. Has little markings for every, I want to say every 1/8 of an inch in both directions. And so when I'm dealing with corners, I can just use the markings on my presser foot to know when to stop, and I'm exactly a 1/4 of an inch away from the bottom edge of whatever I'm working on, and I can turn it, and I will line up perfectly, once again, on the 1/4 inch edge of my presser foot. Obviously, you have to buy presser feet that are specific to your machine, at least the manufacturer of your machine, and whether you have low shank, high shank, that kind of thing. So do some research before you buy a presser foot, but I managed to find a presser foot that fits my Janome machine perfectly, and I love this presser foot. And so I would actually love to hear from all of you out there if you have any tools that you love as much as I love my 1/4 inch presser foot. In the meantime, I have a bonus tool that I would like to give a very big shout out. Obviously it's not exclusive to quilting, and it's something I use for many reasons. And obviously you're using this tool as well because you're watching my video. But I just have to say, YouTube has been a treasure trove of information when it comes to anything that I need to look up. And especially for sewing and quilting. And even recently I started crocheting again, which I haven't done in years. And you know, there was a stitch in the pattern I was using, and so easily, all I had to do was type in, you know, TR2 TOG into Google, and the very first video that came out was a perfect tutorial specifically for that stitch. It was brilliant. And I've done that for quilting so many times where I've come up against something I don't quite understand, whether it's how to face a quilt, how to bind a quilt, how to machine bind a quilt, how to hand bind a quilt, how to improv piece, how to improv curve, you know, how to free motion quilt. All of these things I have been able to find on YouTube, and I don't know quite what I would do without it. I guess, you know, obviously there are workshops and classes and amazing instructors that can tell you all these things, but that involves being on their schedule and spending a lot of money. And YouTube is something I can save these videos and come back to them whenever I need, and it's free. You know, as free as the internet is, I guess, but still, it's amazing. And so thank you for using YouTube to watch my videos, and I would love to hear what people you're following on YouTube that you don't think you could live without. Like, who do you follow on YouTube that just answers all the questions you need when it comes to sewing, quilting, making, whatever it might be. It doesn't have to be just about quilting. It can be whatever you're obsessed with right now. Who are you watching? Please, in the comments below, let's see what everyone's watching, and let's support these people. It's always great to support other makers. They're putting out that information out there, especially on YouTube when it's free. They're putting it out as a free resource for all of us, and that's kind of amazing. What an amazing gift for our community, for our making community. So let's support them and list them out in the comments so that the rest of us can subscribe to them and follow them and watch their videos. I think it'll be great. So thank you so much for watching my top 10 plus 1 bonus tools that I don't think I could live without as a quilter. And be sure to subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss out on any future videos. And please check out my other videos on this channel. I'd love to hear what you think about the things I've been making and the people I've been talking with. And I hope you're all staying safe and healthy. And happy quilting and happy making. Bye-bye.